so I'd like to begin our next panel on the UN Human Rights Council, looking at the greatest challenges requiring civil society capacity building and political will of member states. And our next speaker actually is a great one to have because he's worn many different hats in the entire process. I remember working on certain issues regarding climate change. He was helping the Maldives lead the way, and now is leading with the new NGO known as Universal Rights Group. He's executive director. His name is Marc Limon. But I also want to thank him also for the emails with the new ideas that you're coming up with. Very innovative to try to monitor the UN Human Rights Council, but for a lot of people not in Geneva to still keep up with what's going on. So I think that shows new direction that'll be quite valuable in the next decade of the UN Human Rights Council. So thank you, Marc, very much, and it's great to see you. Thank you.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be here and see so many people, especially when there's food cooking outside. So it's really managing to resist the smell to stay and listen to my presentation. As was just mentioned, I was previously a diplomat here in Geneva from 2006 to 2012, mainly focused on the Human Rights Council. So all of the annoyances that you may feel as you watch the work of the Council, I know what you're going through because I've seen it from the other side, and I know the difficulties and the politics that are involved. And now for the past 2 years I work at a think tank in Geneva where we essentially look at the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms. We think, is this really working? We usually conclude, well, it's not working very well, and then we try and identify things that can be improved. So actually, today I'll talk about the Human Rights Council, which, as you all, I'm sure will know, is one of the three main councils of the UN system, along with the Security Council, the Economic Social Council, and the Human Rights Council. Why are we talking about the Human Rights Council? Well, because it's here in Geneva. It's based in the Palais des Nations, meets 3 times a year, and it's the main intergovernmental decision-making body on human rights in the UN system. So it's an important body. This picture you can see is a shot from the inside. I don't know if you've been in there, have you?
Yes.
Yeah.
UPR actually.
Okay, so you've seen the upturned pizza on the ceiling. Yeah, I'm going to talk about, because next year, 2016, is the 10-year anniversary of the Human Rights Council. There's no formal review under UN rules, but any anniversary, such as the 10th anniversary, is a useful time to take a step back and think about the early history of this council. As you all will know, prior to the Human Rights Council, there was a different body sat atop the Human Rights Pillar, and that was the Commission on Human Rights. But the Commission on Human Rights became discredited for various reasons, and so it was replaced when Kofi Annan was Secretary General by the Human Rights Council. And supposedly the Human Rights Council is a stronger body. It has different mechanisms like the Universal Periodic Review, which again I'm sure you're all aware of. And it was supposed to be more nimble and stronger, more able to deal with human rights issues around the world. And it's still a young body. If it was a child, it would be not even yet a teenager, so it's still in its formative years. And these years are of course important because how we shape the Council in these first 10 years will determine UN policy on human rights for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And as I said, although there are no formal reviews next year, the reason for that is they tried. The states did do a formal review in 2011. It was a bit of a mess. Nobody could agree on anything, so they decided to leave the Council as it is until 2021, when there will be a review of how the Council is doing and whether improvements need to be made. But the point is that a lot of improvements can be made anyway without any new resolutions or any new decisions, just by improving how diplomats and NGOs and others in the council operate and the kind of things that they do. If we have time, I will go through two key issues today. If I don't have time, I'll only cover the first one. The first is the Council living up to the mandate given to it by UN heads of state back in 2006? This is important because the Council was established by a decision of UN heads of state, supported by the General Assembly, and it set a mandate. Heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, heads of government said, this is what the Council should do over the next period of time. So the question is the Council living up to that objective, that mandate? And then the second question is, the UN human rights system is often criticised for being very good at churning out paper, but less good at actually seeing those universal norms realised at domestic level. So has the Council succeeded in filling the so-called implementation gap? So the first question then, is the Council fulfilling the mandate given to it by General Assembly Resolution 6251? The context here that everyone should be aware of right at the beginning is that there are three pillars of the UN. There's security, development and human rights, but they're not equal pillars. In fact, they're very unequal pillars. In fact, the human rights pillar is barely a pillar. It's more like a kind of stunted stump or a few bricks. And that has implications because you'll find while you're in Geneva, a lot of people criticise the Council, criticise the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They say, but hang on, all these violations are happening in my country and you're not doing anything. And there are political reasons for that, but there are also resource reasons for that. And the resource reasons is that states, although they say they love human rights, this picture tells another story. Not to get too boring on UN documentation, but these are actually important resolutions. GA Resolution 60/1, that was the outcome of the World Summit of 2005, when heads of state got together and brought in various reforms to the UN, one of which was the decision to, as I said, replace the Commission on Human Rights with the Human Rights Council. The General Assembly then took that and put meat on the bones and said what this new Human Rights Council would be doing, so essentially set its mandate. That was all in New York. Then the baton was passed here to Geneva, and the initial organisational meetings of the Human Rights Council had to then craft what was called the institution building package. And that was the rules of the game, how the Council would work, what the debates would be about, what the agenda items, what would be the tools at the disposal of the Human Rights Council. And as I said, in 2011 there was a review of the Human Rights Council. And the idea there was, after 5 years, let's see how it's going, and do we need to bring improvements? States basically thought they should bring improvements, but they were not able to agree on what those improvements should be. So in the end, the status quo continued, really. These are really important paragraphs. Even NGOs, academics, and even diplomats are often guilty of not basing an analysis or basing a lobbying campaign or an advocacy campaign on the relevant documents of the UN, and it's important that you do because it gives you strength in your argument. And a good example of that is that you'll hear around town a lot of criticism that, again, the Human Rights Council is very good at having very broad, generic debates about broad, generic themes, which doesn't necessarily lead anywhere. But the Council is much less good at actually addressing violations of human rights. Again, there's a reason for that, and the political reason for that is that states would prefer to talk about nice, gentle, thematic issues, and they definitely don't like being told that there are violations going on in their country. But if you look back at the founding documents of the Human Rights Council, it's very clear. There were only 2 paragraphs in 61 dealing with the council, paragraph 158 and paragraph 159. And as you see, the first one says the council will be responsible for promoting universal respect for human rights. So that's a kind of generic paragraph. But then the next paragraph, 159, says very clearly the council shall address situations of violations of human rights, including gross and systematic violations, and make recommendations thereon. That was it. So you can see from that, and that was further developed in the GA Resolution 6251, creating the council. These same paragraphs appeared again. This is the principal mandate then of the Human Rights Council. It's not broad thematic debate. It is to look at violations of human rights and to respond to those violations. That's not to say it doesn't also have to do norm setting and thematic debate. It does. There are a lot of important work. There is a lot of important work in those areas, but we can't ignore this core mandate. So what has the council been doing since 2006? Well, as you can see, it's been very, very active, hyperactive even. These are the number of resolutions adopted by the council, and it's risen from around 40 in 2006. And a steady growth until last year. It was 112 resolutions adopted. What message can we take from that? Well, that diplomats and states like producing resolutions, but also I think it's fair to say there's a great deal of enthusiasm for this important UN body. Not all states like all aspects of human rights, but everybody is engaging with the Human Rights Council and is using it to develop resolutions on both thematic issues and country-specific issues. If we compare that with the Commission, you see that in the space of 4 or 5 years, the Council's growth in the number of resolutions far surpassed the number of resolutions adopted by the Commission on Human Rights annually. Even though the Commission on Human Rights has been there for 50, 60 years. So again, this shows, I think, that states are spending a lot of time and energy focused on the Human Rights Council and producing resolutions, which are the principal output, of course, of the Human Rights Council. There's also a lot of enthusiasm in terms of talking at the Human Rights Council. One of the main mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, and innovation compared to the Commission, are panel debates. Usually, well, nearly always, oh, bless you. These are usually focused on thematic discussions, although at the last session of the Council there was a panel debate on the situation in North Korea. And again, you can see the popularity of these things go up and up and up. So states like paper, and they like panel debates and like talking. So actually, based on the numbers, it looks as though the Human Rights Council is doing pretty well. There's enthusiasm, it's producing a lot of stuff, this is all good. But of course, quantity isn't everything. Quality is what really matters, especially in an area like the human rights pillar of the United Nations. So it's important then to carry on the analysis and see what the Human Rights Council has been looking at and what substantively it's been doing. Just a reminder again of those objectives, so principal focus on violations, and also in a kind of supplementary way, the Council shall act as a forum for dialogue on thematic issues, but the main point is let's deal with violations. So this is a little bit of a complicated graph, so I'll quickly explain it. The Human Rights Council's work is divided into agenda items. So, for example, agenda item 3 is where states tend to have thematic discussions about the promotion of human rights. Agenda item 4 is where states tend to look at country-specific issues and the violations of human rights, so-called situations that require the Council's attention. Agenda item 7 is where the Council looks at human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories. Agenda item 10 is where the Council talks about giving capacity building and technical support to states to protect human rights. So what does this graph show us? It shows us that the vast majority, almost 60% of the Council's output and work has been focused on agenda item 3, which is general thematic debates. Item 4, which is where they generally deal with violations of human rights, is only 7%. So you see that initial mandate of the Human Rights Council has been turned on its head. Instead of dealing principally with violations, but also looking at thematic issues, the Council has been spending 6% of its time and energy and resources in thematic discussion, and less than 10% of its time looking at and producing resolutions on country-specific resolutions, country-specific situations. This map shows where this council attention has been focused. The different coloured circles represent the different agenda items. So maybe for our discussion today, the important ones are agenda item 4 in red, agenda item 7 in black, and agenda item 10 in blue. Again, 4 violations, 7 is Palestine, 10 is capacity building. And as you can see, not only has the council not looked very much at human rights violations or at country-specific situations, or at challenges facing individual countries in terms of capacity building support and how to help countries, especially developing countries and LDCs, strengthen human rights. Not only have they been not looking very much at these questions, but where they have been looking at these questions, it's been very focused on a few regions of the world. So if you look at this map, you would believe there have been no human rights violations in the past 10 years in Europe, in Western Europe. Nothing in the United States of America, even in Guantanamo Bay. Almost nothing in Latin America. There was one resolution on Honduras a while ago. And the vast majority then of the world's human rights violations take place in Africa. Asia, of course, as well. Okay, there's things there in the Middle East, but and of course Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Cambodia. Nothing in Laos. No violations in Laos. Why is this shocking, or should you be shocked? Because it shows that it's very politicised and it's very selective, the council. That it's not necessarily where violations are happening that matter, it's who has friends in the right places, who can protect themselves, can certain countries stay below the radar. Why Africa? With Africa, it really is because Africa is actually a very, very positive regional group in the Human Rights Council, generally. It's a region which does engage with the UN human rights system and puts itself out there and says, look, you know, here we are, we're going to work with the Human Rights Council, and as part of that, sometimes they might be subject to resolutions, and they usually engage on that. A lot of other places in the world, of course, say, don't you even dare come anywhere near. That's a border, and you're not coming past that border. And you see that kind of behaviour, so lack of cooperation is often rewarded. And as I said, there's the selectivity side that it's inconceivable that anyone would table a resolution about human rights violations in the West. It's not impossible, it could happen, but I've never even heard it raised as a suggestion. So again, is the council living up to its mandate? I would say no. This this kind of imbalance can be seen as well with special procedure mandates. Here, we show a big growth in time in the number of special procedures. So these are the, I guess you've talked about special procedures, so the kind of eyes and ears, some people call them the frontline troops, the people who go around the world looking into human rights issues, developing norms, talking to states about how to improve their performance. So the big growth, but the growth has been heavily skewed towards thematic mandates again, so which are important. I'm not saying it's not important. Developing human rights norms has been a key goal of the UN. However, this mechanism was initially established to look into country situations in initially apartheid South Africa, then the occupied Palestinian territories, then Chile, then Argentina, Guatemala. But since then, the number of country-specific mandates, we call them, has gone down, so that's the bottom line, and the number of thematic mandates is far outstripping that. So again, we see, if we compare that to the mandate of the council, we see an imbalance. So the second question then is the council bridging the so-called implementation gap? Which, by the way, has been talked about for 30, 40 years. I think there's always been a recognition that the UN is good at talking and good at producing resolutions, but is rather less good at actually seeing those resolutions or recommendations or norms or obligations implemented by states. I mean, it's important to remember here that things like the Universal Periodic Review have, which is an innovation of the Human Rights Council, have really helped. I mean, there is a positive side to this implementation gap that we and others have noticed, and UPR has been part of that, because the UPR, every country in the world, as you know, has to be reviewed on a periodic basis. And this is a kind of promotion mechanism, so states don't mind it. In fact, states quite like it. And that means that if a state receives a set of recommendations, the state has, an inclination towards implementing. Not in all cases, of course, but there is a sense that this works because it's a cooperative mechanism. It's not pointing fingers, it's not naming and shaming. Special procedures, which again is another key mechanism for implementation, as you saw from that map before, have expanded rapidly. And there are more treaty bodies, of course, than there were, and these are kind of the mechanisms at the end of the day are the way in which the Human Rights Council and the international community try to translate universal norms into local reality. So in principle, the growth and elaboration of these mechanisms is a good thing and has had definitely some discernible impact. Is wider, but special procedures, okay, we said there's more and more of these. And then I seem to suggest that because there's more of these things, that's going to help with implementation of norms. But is it? So we getting the balance right in terms of the number of special procedures. We did a big study of special procedures with Brookings Institution, and basically our conclusion was there's a problem. We're getting to the stage now where I think we can justifiably say that there may be too many special procedures. Because, why? Well, because states have to do something with the output of these special procedures, i.e. they have to implement the recommendations. And what's happening now is there are so many of these special procedures that if you ever go to a session of the Human Rights Council, there's very, very little space for states to be able to interact with these special rapporteurs. Because the more of them there are, the less time each of them has to speak in the Human Rights Council. So it's now got to the stage where so-called interactive dialogues between states and special procedures, in our opinion, are no longer either interactive or a dialogue. They're essentially a couple of minutes, each state has a couple of minutes to talk to these special rapporteurs. Also country visits. Okay, there's more and more of these special rapporteurs, but there are relatively few countries in the world that are willing to accept visits by special rapporteurs because they're worried they'll come and criticise them. So what happens is countries with already good records in the field of human rights tend to get fed up because they have lots of special procedures coming all the time, and they, after a while, they say, well, hang on, why have we got 4 visits this year? And you know, that country over there, where actually we all know there are violations of human rights going on, hasn't received a visit in 6-7 years. Again, it's a problem, and this is really because the UN human rights system is a cooperative system. It's not like the Security Council where it can impose its will. It needs to try and engage and get the cooperation of states. Also, more special procedures are able to receive more petitions from people like you. So the idea is if there's a violation in Laos or wherever, and you don't get remedy from the government, you can, in theory, write to the UN and say, look, this has happened to me, could you help? And lots of people do that. And you may think more special procedures means more effective responses to those petitions. But actually, again, it's dependent on the willingness of a state to reply to this allegation. And in half of the cases, states don't reply. And it's also dependent on the ability of the UN, or the capacity of the UN to process all of these petitions. And as you saw at the beginning, from those 3 pillars, the UN human rights system doesn't have much in the way of resources. And all of this is not to say that these things don't work, they do. And you should continue and be encouraged to send petitions to the UN. But it's just to say there are challenges as the Council reaches its 10th anniversary. This graph shows what I was talking about cooperation. So on the right you have the regional groups and whether they have standing invitations. So these are permanent invitations for special rapporteurs to visit whenever they like. And as you can see in the Western group, 93% of states have a standing invitation. So special rapporteurs can come, in theory, whenever they like. In Latin America, it's 55%. If we look at the Asia Pacific group, the APG, it's just over 40%. So, so that means, nearly 60% of Asia Pacific countries don't have this standing invitation. So which shows a less of a willingness to allow these special rapporteurs to visit the country. On the other hand, so the bar graph on the side shows that Asia Pacific, obviously because it's a big region, gets a lot of visits requests. So 524 in the case of Asia Pacific. I forget the time frame here, but and of those, Asia Pacific countries have allowed about 47% to go ahead, and 53% have been refused or have not been facilitated. And yeah, I'll stop there. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mark, for looking beyond the numbers, but still looking at how it impacts people's lives. But we know it's getting all the statistics and being able to show what's going on is quite crucial and significant. So then we'll have one more brief presentation, and then we have our next panel as well that will even feature a special procedure. So it's an excellent connection. So.
Thank you.
Fellow human rights advocates, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Inthavong. I am with Alliance Democracy in Laos. I am very concerned with the NGO in Laos today is influenced by the Lao PDR government. The UN Human Rights Council, the greatest challenges requiring council, society capacity building, and will of the member states. Demonstrates and collaborate much political will, involvement, and concerted effort. The situation of the human rights in Laos has often been and remains a recognized cause of the serious concerns. The Laos government is a dictatorship, is ruled by one-party communist government backed by the Laos PDR People Army in alliance with the Vietnam People Army and Socialism Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. The Laos government is well on its way to becoming the most repressive country in the Southeast Asia. The official Lao government position on the human rights policy objectives of both of Laos communists and international donors remain focused towards achieving sustainable economic growth and poverty reduction. However, in the U.S. States Department of 2006 report mentions the government overall human rights record worsen. In reality, Laos citizens are still under the rule of an oppressive and repressive government and suffer recorded and reported violation of human rights are occurring at the hands of Lao government authorities, Laos, PDR, and Vietnam troops, including but not exclusive to maltreatment, discrimination, sexual and physical abuse and violence, rape of boys, girls, women, general brutality, human trafficking, forced sex labor, stealing and selling of body parts, usually ending in death, promising threats to life, death, including imprisonment, followed by brutality. Death despite no execution have been reported since 1989. The death penalty remains in force, including 39 people sentenced to death between 2003-2009, with 50 or more sentenced to death in 2010. Denial and disappearance of citizens, more recently with Dr. Sombat Sompon. Human rights violations, including the above list, targeting Hmong refugees, including unmet promises of resettlement along the forced repatriations, genocide, increasingly restrictive measures such as freedom of speech and expression, media freedom cell, internet surveillance, censorship and usage, which increases restrictions of overall freedom, continued protection of human rights offenders, and lack of protection of human rights defenders, increases limitation of NGOs' involvement and collaborations, including permanent state supervision. NGOs are not play out according to the rules that can be severe. Forcing to cooperate with state-controlled organizations. More recently, tightening regulations for license of NGOs. Obligations to inform the finance ministry in cases where they receive large donations, limited of operations in areas such as agriculture, education, public health, and science and sports. Most concern to NGOs will be not able to extend to such sensitive areas such as the construction of society. In closing with the threats and of the constant consequences hanging in the air, promises of the harm when speaking actions on your basic rights, one can be threatened, treated with brutality, including violence and death. With these barriers and challenges in mind, what can we reasonably expect from the citizens of Laos in standing up and imparted their rights? This is and should continue to cause international concern. I have seen an example because I was in Kuala Lumpur. APF 2015 is ASEAN People's Forum. Meeting was held in past April. It was shown that to us, NGO from Laos PDR has reported to Laos PDR government return to their country. They can only answer limited questions from other NGOs and the public. Challenges of Laos PDR government and authorities in implementing civil society capacity building, and we the people of Laos call on your continued support and the increased actions, political will of all member states. And I thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
I think as we're concluding, we kind of have two examples. We have one, really a stock taking of what exists at the UN, and then we also have an example of where civil society feels it's not working. So I think one thing that we could at least begin the conversation at for the next decade is doing some case studies of specific situations in states where there's an active civil society, like the groups that have assembled here today, and see what mechanisms could work, and try systematically to see if there can be results, because that's the point that I think that Marc raised very well. Is it does create a lot of paper, it does create a lot of panels, but of course when you look at those important paragraphs that you highlighted, then it makes a difference in the lives of people, that human rights are realized. So I think that's really the task that we have now before us as we look at our final couple panels, and looking even specifically at the case study of the UPR of Laos that just happened in January at the beginning of this year. Is how can we be more effective? Is it just a case that civil society on the grassroots level doesn't understand the global, and is it too complex, or is it that states are doing good to make sure that it's not as effective as it could be? So I think that really puts the framework for where we need to go in this next decade, of looking specifically at situations and which special procedures, and then testing to see if it does work. Because many indigenous peoples came up with similar situations with treaty bodies and getting recommendations, but seeing if it's really changing things on the ground. So it's a constant question I think we always have to put forward and work at. But two sides. One of civil society taking what Adrian said today of not just complaining, but creatively participating, and at the same time making sure that states, the genuine partners, are actually working to make sure the Human Rights Council does work. And I think Marc has that unique perspective of being a diplomat for the 6 years and now being the think tank, and trying to say the reflection is a great part of being a think tank, and then the implementation, of course, is where it's most important. So we'd like to thank our panel. Is there any closing comments? Or? Okay, so we'll we'll close. We know there's also been a lot of discussion and people want to have a systematic summary in Lao. So we're going to try to introduce that part right now. Our next panel, we're looking at Global Bill of Rights, and we have one of the speakers Skyping in from San Francisco. So we'll get that set up right now, and we'll have our other panels come up, but then you can speak to everyone and translate some of the key aspects that's difficult to look at, that's not quite in Laotian, to make sure everyone's informed. So take a brief stretch and move forward that way. Thank you, Marc.
Josh, are you able to translate?